The next few sessions are going to be about using sacred texts in our prayer life and how to pray sacred texts. And so I thought I'd take this session to discuss what we mean by a sacred text. And in this session, I mean we'll only be talking about written texts. Other texts such as picture, nature, music, sound, we'll talk about perhaps in other sessions. So what is a sacred text? I want to suggest that a sacred text is a written work that opens us to what we are calling the source. In one way, it can be any text, because if we believe the source is behind everything and in everything. But some texts over time have taken on a special meaning and a special help in people reaching the source, and a special place, particularly within certain traditions. But also some of those have leached out and become more generally used by people who are trying to live a life of prayer. So let's think about some of the types of sacred texts. The first are the classics, and most of these are foundational or highly significant in a specific tradition. We'll talk about the importance of tradition in another video. So for Christians, it's the Bible, the Old and New Testament. For Islam, it's the Quran. For Jewish people, the Torah. For Hindus, the Vedas or the Bhagavad Gita, or maybe the Pali Canon in Buddhism are just examples, of course, many others. And these are foundational documents which people go back to. The second type, sacred text, is what I want to call secondary sources. And they're books were normally written by practitioners of great traditions. Often people have had mystical experiences or experiences that will lead to deep prayer, and they describe these experiences or exercises that will lead to that. So examples of this would be in Christianity, John of the Cross, Hildegard of Bingen, the Philokalia, in Jewish, the Kabbalah or Hasidism, for Islam, the Sufis, in Hinduism, Tekar or Ramakrishna, and Buddhism, the Tibetan Book of the Dead or Rodikon or something of that nature. So these are not so much the core text, but these are people who reflect upon those core texts and then become significant parts of their tradition. And again, quite often they bleed out into other traditions, and so certain writings, say in Christianity around, you can find certain practices in prayer that in Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism, such as mindfulness, is found in all those traditions in one form or another. And then what I want to call the non-traditional, and I call these non-traditional because they are not sometimes fully accepted as part of a tradition, because they might have been recently written, or they come from a fringe part of the tradition, often because of the racial background to it. The people who wrote it, their class or clan or race, maybe their class. So in many traditions that things from the upper class or the wealthier people or the richer, more powerful people are respected, while those traditions coming from the underclass or from the lower classes are less so. And of course, the other issue is gender. Quite often, these things might be written by women, and these traditions have a very low opinion of the place of women and their voice within the tradition. And I think that applies for virtually every tradition has had that at one time or another. And just three that speak to me, but there's so many of them, and so, as I say, sometimes they're controversial. So first, a poet named Joanne Krieger, who I am very touched by. She died just recently. She comes out of the Buddhist tradition, white Buddhist tradition, and she writes, her poetry really reflects not only on these great spiritual issues, but also ties it into very much the day-to-day life of a person. Another one who comes from a sort of, I guess, non-church tradition or non-religious tradition is Dag Hammarskjöld, the famous Secretary General of the UN, who was killed in what is today Congo. But he wrote a sort of daybook of where he jotted down reflections and readings and things that reflected on his spiritual life. And then another one, which I've just read recently, but I love, is The Pilgrim at Tinker's Creek, by Annie Dillard, and that's her account of her living for a year in the mountains, the Appalachian Mountains of America, and her reflections on the spirituality of nature. So that's just three examples. I'm sure all of you have got your own. So how do we read these texts? The first thing is to find one. That might seem simple, but it can be quite difficult. Now, many of you might be part of a tradition, and so you already have, as it were, the approved text, and you might want to go to that. But maybe if you want to use one of the secondary sources that aren't traditional sources, that might be a bit more difficult. So if you want to use one of those, or you're not sure what you want to do, first ask someone you trust. That's the first place. Talk to someone who you respect their spirituality, you respect their life of prayer, and ask them what works for them, and they can point you in some directions. The second is for popular Google, right? Spiritual texts, whatever interests you. If you're spiritual texts in creation or nature, if nature is something that connects with you, or spiritual texts in poetry. There is actually a book called The Penguin Book of Spiritual Writing, which I could recommend as well. But also, I think the main thing in this is to be aware, just to be watchful, because the text might very well find you. Iris Murdoch, a very well-known novelist and philosopher, made the statement once that every scholar knows a phenomena that the book you need will fall into your hands just when you need it. And I believe the same with spiritual texts. So you might be walking through the library one day and just something catches your eye, or in a used bookstore, or in a bookstore, or read something in the newspaper, or see it online, and it will speak to you. And in my own life, that has happened many times, that the book I need at a very moment just seems somehow or another finds me. In fact, a book I'm reading now just literally was mentioned in another book, and I just looked at it, and it's really been a very important part of my life right now. With all these texts, it's important. Be patient. You're not trying to get through them as fast as you can. You're not trying to get all the information out of them. Take your time and just be with the book. I remember I had a very wise friend, and I just finished my academic training, and a big new book that people were supposed to read came out. It was an 800-page book, and I remember this very wise gentleman said, yes, I just bought that. It will take me 2 or 3 years to read it, but I'll learn so much from it. And that was a real radical thing for me, because coming out of academia, you get your books, you read them, you produce your essays or your term paper or whatever, and move on to the next one. And you have to sort of eat through this stuff very quickly, get this information, put it down, and move on to the next. And he was showing me, now that I was out of that world, I could take time to be with a book and allow it to be within me, to take time to drop it and pick it up again and learn from it in its deepest way. Not just try to understand what it's saying, but actually to fully engage with it. So take your time. Be patient. We're not trying to write an essay. We're not trying to pass a test. We're trying to allow this text to speak to us. So first thing you do is take the text and read it. Just read it all the way through. Just get through and get what its big picture is. What big picture is it trying to show? Don't try and engage with things. Just read it as if it was a novel, a cheap novel, and just read it all the way through. If it's a longer text, don't read the whole thing. Choose a smaller section. I'd say no more than 20 pages. And when we come to daily prayer sessions, you're going to use in smaller sections. So once you've read through the whole text a few times, not taking notes, just to get a sense of it, just to feel how the language is, to get the big picture, then it's time to engage with it specifically as a prayer item. This is not an academic study. You don't need to know the background of the author. You won't need to know what the scholars think the text says. That has a place. It is important that we do that at times, but that is not what we're doing here. We are not studying texts, but we're praying it. And the important thing is the text is there for us as a way of communicating with the source. So it doesn't really matter what the authors intended, or even how the tradition understands it. The question is, what does this text have to say to us right now? To us right now. In a sense, we want the text to talk to us. Or maybe better, that we want to allow the source to communicate to us through the text. So in the next 2 sessions, we'll be using a text as a part of our prayer life.